Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight and our last keynote speaker. I'm very excited to be introducing Dana Worth. Dana is the Vice President of Strategic Sales and Partnerships at Impossible Foods, the company known for bringing the Impossible Burger to restaurants and supermarkets near you. Dana joined the company in 2015 and was responsible for the groundbreaking partnership with Burger King. Impossible has become a major player in the next generation food industry. Dana, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here. I understand that we have people from all over the world. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm in San Francisco, broadcasting from my dining room like most of us. So what I wanted to do in the next 30 minutes is spend a little bit of time talking to you about Impossible Foods as a company. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the company, but you may not know all the ins and outs. And so I wanted to start there. And then I wanted to offer a few thoughts on where we are in this most recent crisis and the events, even the pieces of it that are changing in the last 72 hours, which I think are really relevant to the topic here. And then finally, we're going to have some time for question and answer. So Kristen has a few questions for me, I know, but I also understand that there's a chat function. So please feel free to lob questions over, and I'll do my best to answer them. Great. So hopefully everybody can see what I'm broadcasting here, a nice big black screen that says Impossible Foods. I want to talk to you about what it is that we do. So we started off with an insight that seems blindingly obvious, but meat is delicious. We love meat, right? Many of us eat meat. When I do these talks in a live room, I oftentimes ask people, how many people eat meat? And 90+% of people's hands go up. And so we're not here to try to tell anyone that meat is not delicious. We want to be able to eat meat for generations and generations to come. The problem is not meat itself. The problem is the way meat is made. When I do that same question of how many of you eat meat, and 90% of people put their hands up, my follow-up question is, how many of you like the fact that it comes from the carcass of a dead animal? And most people put their hands down at that point. For most of us, to use the tech term, the fact that it comes from an animal is a bug, not a feature. And so what we set out to do was to try to deliver all the things that we love about meat, the taste, the sizzle, the smell, the traditions that it fits into, the price point, the accessibility, all those things, but change the way that meat is made so that we can continue to eat it for generations to come, and that we'll have a planet to eat it on for generations to come. This may have been covered earlier in the summit, but I think it's becoming increasingly apparent to people that the way that meat is made today is extremely destructive. And it's funny, I've been at the company about 5 years. When I started, before the Impossible Burger was on the market, this was not a fact that most people knew. People associated their gasoline and their cars with climate change. They associated, leaving the lights on or not composting, but they thought very little about the food that they ate and its relationship to the environment. That's starting to change. And as we say here, it was the number 3 reason for why people chose their food when we did this survey recently, up from number 10. And even more recently, you may have seen in the press, people are starting to draw the link between infectious diseases like the coronavirus and the interaction that we have with animals. So there's just some quick stats on the bottom here. These are all from UN and FAO and others. The making of animal products, so meat, fish, and dairy, consumes about 45% of Earth's land area, 25% of all fresh water, and somewhere between 15 and 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's on par with the entire transportation industry combined. And pretty staggering. As I mentioned, we're not anti-meat. We actually love meat. I'm a meat eater myself. What we're trying to do is make it a different way. So as you may know, we started with making our product from plants. So I know there's lots of other players out there in the field. There's folks doing this from a cellular point of view. We don't do that. We start with plant ingredients, including one very special one that I'll tell you about in a second. And from the beginning, we focused on delicious. So we were a company for about 5 years, from 2011 to 2016, before we even started selling our product. And that was mostly trying to get delicious right. It turns out that nutritious is actually pretty easy. Sustainable is actually pretty easy when you're not using an animal. But doing those things and being delicious is the hard part. As many who've had veggie burgers of the past can attest. They were nutritious, they were sustainable. Some of them were affordable, but they were nowhere near delicious. What we found is that by being able to combine delicious, nutritious, and sustainable, we're also creating a product that's good for business. So I'll talk a little bit later about the impact on our customers, but it's been phenomenal, as those of you who follow this space, I'm sure, have seen. This is our special ingredient. You may have heard of it. It's called heme, or hemoglobin. This is what we spent all that time between 2011 and 2016 focusing on, trying to understand why meat tastes like meat. Why does a steak go from being kind of odorless, tasteless, frankly, when it's raw, to being this delicious, just explosion of flavors when you put it on the grill? And the reason why is there's actually a chemistry reaction going on. Amino acids, vitamins, fatty acids, simple sugars, when combined with heme, this catalyst, and then having heat applied, creates all these new flavors and aromas. That's why they actually don't smell or taste as good after an hour, because those flavors and aromas that were generated in cooking have dissipated. So we discovered that heme is really critical to making meat taste like meat. It's also, by the way, happens to be essential for life. It's in every plant and animal out there. So every living cell has a form of heme in it. And what this allowed us to do was actually go and extract that heme from plants instead of having to extract it from animals. And the way we do that is with genetic engineering. So we use a fermentation process where we ferment a yeast, turn it into a little heme machine, and then extract the heme from it and purify it to put it into our product. And this is a really important thing. A lot of, actually all other products on the market, when you're heating them, all you're doing is warming them up. You're not actually creating any cooking, any chemistry. And this is really important for our product. It goes from raw to cooked, just in the way that you would expect a burger to go from raw to cooked. As I mentioned, the sustainability part comes with the territory when using plants instead of using animals. I'm sure you've heard this over the last few days, but having a cow or a pig or a chicken eat a bunch of plants, roam around for a while, varying degrees of time depending on the animal, and then be slaughtered is not a super efficient way to make the food that we all love. By cutting out the middleman and going straight from the underlying plant ingredients into the food that we eat, we can save quite a bit of things that are important to us. So these are all numbers here that are validated by a audited third party that we use to do our life cycle assessment. So this is 96% less land when you eat a Impossible Burger compared to a beef burger, 87% less water, and 89% fewer emissions. We actually just launched on our website an impact calculator. If you go to impossiblefoods.com/impact, where you can calculate your own impact in terms of things like miles driven or showers saved. And it's a really fun little interactive site you can go to. This is super important to us. This is why we do what we do. We were founded for the environment. Pat Brown, our founder, was a Stanford professor, an MD, PhD. Never occurred to him to start a company. What did occur to him was that if we kept up eating meat and making meat the way we do, that we won't be in a good place as a planet in the next couple decades. So I mentioned the impact that we have on our customers. At the end of the day, to make the change we want to make, we felt that the best way to do it was to make a better product and then let the market take over. So to do that, we have to compete in the marketplace for customers, meaning restaurants, for consumers, meaning the guests who come into the restaurants, and now with our recent launches in retail, for retailers and consumers at the grocery store as well. The good news is we've seen across the board from our beginnings back in 2016, when we were just in smaller high-end restaurants, to our most recent commercial successes, both in Burger King last year, and then just this past week, we've announced expansion into the Safeway Albertson system, as well as 1,700 Kroger restaurants in 28 states. We've seen that Impossible Foods is good for business. So at Burger King, we drove an incredible 24% increase in traffic at launch. And we did a little test in St. Louis. The really cool thing is that we've seen that sustain over time. So our test was April of 2019. Burger King just did their earnings report last week, and their CEO on the earnings call to investors cited the Impossible Whopper as one of their core growth drivers for Q1, even in spite of what's happening with COVID. We also see that we have a high degree of repeat, so 80% of folks who buy our product come back again. We've also found that for many of these operators, these are new customers that are coming in the door. This is not cannibalistic to their existing business. So as for any of you who've worked in restaurants or own or run a restaurant, you know that the ability to bring new customers in the door is paramount. The last thing is these customers are ordering, they're a different type of customer, they're ordering more. So we've seen at Umami Burger, a huge lift in sales, and even at Burger King, that the check size was larger. So an Impossible Whopper costs about $1 more than a beef Whopper. It's about $5.50 versus $4.50. That being said, the average check at Burger King for checks with Impossible has gone up from $7.30, $7.40, all the way up to north of $10. Meaning it's not just the increased purchase price of the Whopper that's driving it, but it's the attach of other items there. So Chris Finazzo, who we work with closely, CEO of Burger King North America, talked about this as unprecedented, the most successful product launch in his generation. Very exciting. And I'm happy to answer more questions around that. I've been very closely involved with these commercial launches. From a marketing standpoint, the other thing that's really interesting, and these are some surveys that we ran, is that adding Impossible to your menu actually improves perception of your restaurant and the other items on your menu as well. And this is probably what's driving some of this repeat. So you can see it here, 60% improve overall perception, almost 60% say they would be more likely to visit a restaurant if it did offer Impossible, and over 60% saying that they would be likely to visit again if it had Impossible. So restaurateurs are finding not just the sale of the incremental Impossible item, but that it's improving people's perception of all items on their menu across the board. And that's related to some of these underlying trends that I'm sure you guys have talked about in the last few days with where the consumer is going and what they care about. So thought I'd include some fun photos after all those numbers. One of the things that we really strove for from the very beginning was making our product versatile. So actually the first product we launched was not a patty, it was a ground beef brick, with the idea that ground beef is actually used in quite a few applications. And so we wanted chefs to be able to do whatever it is that they wanted to do. So there's 8 examples here of different applications in different cultures and different restaurant types that all use ground beef. What's really exciting is you don't have to learn how to cook Impossible a different way than what you would normally be doing. So it was really important to us, not just to the end consumer, but to the back of house, to the chefs and the line cooks and the people who are prepping, that the meat behaves exactly the same way. It comes in on the same truck, goes into the same freezer, goes into the same holding unit, goes onto the same grill, goes on the same plate. So we're not having to rewire or change the way that they're doing their operations, which is key for scale. I just want to leave you with our mission and our strategy. I usually start with this, but I thought today that I would give you a little bit of understanding of how we do what we do before wrapping up with why we do it. So our mission is to restore biodiversity and reduce the impact of climate change by transforming the global food system. As I mentioned, the way that we plan to do that is to compete. We want to compete in the open market. So we've spent tons of time and tons of money trying to make the world's most delicious, nutritious, affordable, and sustainable animal products, but from plants rather instead, and letting consumers choose. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I would love to entertain any questions that are out there after I just say a few words about where we are in the current crisis. So what's been really interesting since March, when this all started to hit, at least here in the United States, is the unfolding nature of this. And for those of you who've been following the headlines, I'm sure you've seen the pressure that is on the animal meat supply chain. In some ways this isn't surprising. And that supply chain, we've known and been talking about for years how fragile that supply chain is. The biggest meat packers in the world operate on razor thin margins, some quarters being profitable, some quarters being unprofitable. And you need the whole chain to work to make anyone profitable. So, old dairy cows become hamburger and that's the way that you can make the economics work. So a shock such as this one, kind of unsurprisingly, has created a lot of havoc in the supply chain. Obviously, compound that with the fact that the working environment is shoulder to shoulder and not great for social distancing. And you're seeing the chairman of Tyson writing a couple weeks ago about the threat to the meat supply chain, and now this week actually seeing shortages. So Costco has reported Costco's limiting ability to purchase. Wendy's was out in about 20% of their stores of beef in about 20% of their stores. And what we're seeing is that this is really highlighting for us that the model is not just about creating something that tastes better, although that's super important, but it's actually about creating a more sustainable supply chain at the end of the day, because we don't have to grow animals, ship them around, slaughter them, et cetera. That's an inherently heavy supply chain to have to deal with. So it's been a very interesting time. It's changing as we speak. Not to mention the retail and the food service environment, which I'm happy to speak about as well. But very interesting time to be involved in this, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dana. Really appreciate that super insightful presentation. We do have a bunch of audience questions, so I'll try to pick some that I think will be interesting for the audience. One on the topic that, I guess these two we can kind of combine, on the topic that you were just discussing. With regards to the mix of products sold directly to consumers and restaurants, one, what does that mix look like, and how does COVID impact the way you manage that mix moving forward? And given, I mean, this is kind of a combo question, but given the primarily B2B driven growth strategy so far, can you speak about the marketing strategy that Impossible has chosen, the sales funnel, and why they've chosen to do B2B primarily up until this point?
Sure. So both good questions. I'm going to take your second one first, because I think it leads into the first one you asked. So why we chose to go to market the way we did. So this was back in 2015, 2016, when we were trying to figure out, we had a blank slate. We could go to retail, we could go to food service, we could focus on the coast, we could focus somewhere else, we could go overseas. Really, the whole world was open to us. And why we chose to do what we did. So we got very specific about what we thought we needed to convince the consumer of. And like all kind of great insights, it sounds blindingly simple at the end of the day, but took us months to get to, which was most consumers think that stuff made out of plants doesn't taste very good. We need them to think this one is different. And if you remember back to 2015, this was not at all a movement or apparent the way that it is now. I as our first salesperson, I literally was cursed at and told to get the F out of kitchens by some particularly salty chefs in New York, and to go back to California because I was a hippie. And so this was, that frankly wouldn't happen today because of the way that people have changed. So why we chose to do this, we felt we needed to convince consumers that this thing was different, and that it was going to be very hard to convince consumers of that by taking up a small piece of real estate on a retail shelf. You have very little room to communicate to the consumer. You need to invest heavily before the consumer walks into the store around brand recognition. Also, the purchase occasion is different. When you're in a grocery store, oftentimes you're on a destination trip. You're trying to get in and out and get your list done as quickly as possible. Versus in the food service environment, especially the places where we started, the more high-end places, you are in a trial mindset, right? The special of the day is a thing that restaurants do because they know that people are willing to try. And it also de-risked some of the trial in the sense that if two of us were going to dinner at the same time, one of us could buy the Impossible Burger, another could buy a beef burger, and we could compare. And if I didn't like mine, I didn't feel like I was fully committing myself to it. So there was a lot of good reasons to start in food service and build the brand there. As the second question alluded to was, how are we transitioning now? As a private company, fortunately, we have the liberty of not disclosing what our product mix is, but just by looking at locations on our website, you know that we were heavily favored towards the food service industry leading up to this. And if you've been following credit card spend data and the like, obviously there was a bunch of pantry loading in March. It's interesting, actually, Where it's settling out right now is retail is only up by about 5 to 10% year on year after the pantry loading has passed, and food service is actually only down. If you look at the QSR earnings reports from last week, is actually only down about 15 to 20%. So it's evened out more than the initial shock would have led one to believe. That being said, clearly, we had already planned to launch in retail this year. We've accelerated all those launches, which is why you saw the Safeway Albertsons announcement 2 weeks ago, or last week rather, and the Kroger announcement this week. Those were things that had been in the works for quite a while, but we were able to move forward as buyers in those places are looking for protein, and so they're excited about it.
Okay, great. There are a couple of questions here that I think we can also kind of combine. People have generally rejected GMO, genetically modified products in the past. Why do you think Impossible has been successful in spite of this? And are there any lessons that you think can be applied to remove the negative perception of some of these ingredients?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of two things. One is not getting too cute about it. So we've always been incredibly straightforward with people. So, we could have split hairs and said, well, technically heme isn't GMO because it's just the yeast that's GMO, not the protein itself. But we don't even go there. If you look on our website at our FAQ, do you use GMO ingredients? The first word is yes. It's very simple and straightforward. If people do not want to eat those ingredients, they're welcome. They have the right information. They're welcome to go choose something else. So it's been very important, and we've gone over and above. We 3 years ago we invited journalists into our lab to see what we're doing, and we've never tried to hide or talk badly in any way about GMOs. It's never been because if you start to talk about it as if it's a trade-off you had to make, or it's something that you wish you didn't have to do, then you're kind of implicitly demonizing that. And as a company full of scientists, there's no reason to do that. GMOs are safe, and not only are they safe, they're an important part of solving our the future of food. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is we've just been stalwarts about the science. Like we're a science-driven company in everything we do, whether we're talking about our ingredients, whether we're talking about our food safety, whether we're talking about, frankly, the fact that we had to do animal tests to approve our heme, which was a big controversy. And at every point along the way, we've outlined, and you can find this all on our blog, we've outlined why we made the decisions we chose to make and how they've been based in science from the very beginning.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dana. We have time for a couple more questions. Here's one that's probably pretty relevant for the big context of our AgTech conference. Impossible obviously focuses on creating delicious meat-like but meat-less food. How do you view the role of more sustainable farming practices in conjunction with these efforts? In the long term, do you envision Impossible products as a supplement to animal products or as a complete replacement for animal products?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to the first part about sustainable farming practices, I don't know whether you were referring specifically to animal farming, but if you're referring to farming in general, farming is a critical. We use plant ingredients. Farming is a critical part of what we're doing, and we've actually spent quite a bit of time with the folks up at UC Davis. We ourselves have spent a bunch of time in fields, especially early on as we were trying to find ingredients. So farming is an important part of what we do and will continue to be. And agriculture is one very big part of what we do. To the question of, is this something that coincides or replaces over the long term? My view is that it replaces over the long term. That we're on track to deliver a product that exceeds on every dimension that the consumer cares about the incumbent product. So it would be surprising to me in the long term if we had a product that was more delicious, more accessible, better priced, and more sustainable and better for you that didn't replace the existing product. There might be novelty and things that people do for fun in the same way that people still ride horses, but they don't use them as their primary form of transportation to get to work and back.
Okay, sure. Great analogy. We do have time for a couple of more questions. This is a question following your presentation. We understand that there are about 80% of people who have expressed an interest in eating Impossible again, but do you have a sense of what percent people are willing to try it in general from some of these commercial launches? And who do you think is your core consumer, and what do you think draws them to your product?
Yeah, so our core consumer, it's interesting. We have, if you just look as a mass, it's about even gender divide, about 50% male, 50% female, skews a little bit younger, as you might imagine, as a whole, but actually pretty geographically diverse. So if you go back to our early launches, we launched in New York. Second, we launched in LA, San Francisco, and third, we launched in Houston, and fourth, we launched in Cleveland, Ohio. And the point was, that was very deliberate. The point was to make it clear very early on that this was not something that was just a premium priced, people who love farmers markets and backyard gardens, that we wanted this to be, both of those are important, they don't deliver solutions at scale, and that we wanted this to be something that was for everybody. And even though in general, we tend to skew younger, you see these funny little blips. So it turns out that middle-aged men, so men over 50, actually we do very well with, because there's no cholesterol in our product. So if you are somebody who's been on cholesterol drugs for 5 or 10 years, and you have your doctor haranguing you about eating too much meat, and we come along and offer you a way to continue to enjoy the meat that you love in the way you love it, right? Throwing it on your grill, having a burger at Burger King, but you don't have to go face your doctor at the end of the month about it. That seems like a pretty good deal.
That's great. That's a super interesting statistic there. I do think I am going to combine this with another question that I had for you. You came to this industry through the world of business. You were a consultant, then you got your MBA and moved to corporate side. What have been the biggest challenges and learnings from this growth trajectory at Impossible as a business person? And do you have any advice for entrepreneurs as they hope to scale?
Sure, a couple pieces of advice. So one is that the challenges of growth, I think, are more important when you're talking about starting a company than the challenges of any particular industry. So while it is important to find people who understand the nuances of an industry, and there certainly are lots of nuances in the very Byzantine food service industry, especially. The main thing, I spend 80% of my day focused on problems that have nothing to do in kind of a general sense with the food industry. They have a lot to do with things that would be very familiar to other entrepreneurs. How do we balance supply and demand? How do we set a product roadmap? How do we craft a pitch that is compelling for a consumer or an operator who has a million things on their plate and is focused on something else? And so, when I hire, for example, I'm always looking for people who have demonstrated the ability to make sense of complex, uncertain environments, and oftentimes growth environments. Experience with growth environments is just that. But the second piece I would say is, it's one of the wonderful things about working at Impossible is how clear we are on our mission, and we're just unabashed about it. And so I don't want to sound like a total, you can, doesn't matter what you're working on, a widget's a widget is a widget. A lot of what animates me and makes my job enjoyable on a daily basis is the fact that I care passionately about the food system and about our role in the food system and about the impact of the food system on the planet. And that is important to me. And it doesn't, I had a mentor once who told me how you have an impact, is very personal. It doesn't have to be, there's no right way or wrong way to have an impact, but it has to work for you. And so for some people, that means working in refugee camps on the front lines. For others, it can mean, sitting in an office in California. For others, it's something in between. But I found in my various jobs that if I don't relate to the impact that the company is having, it gets old very fast.
Great. I think that is about as much time as we have right now, but Wanted to thank you so much for coming and speaking to us about Impossible. Super interesting presentation, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to seeing some of you in the future. Hopefully you go out and start companies.
Great. Thank you very much.
Bye.